Okay, so I'll see. Okay, so that I can run in another one. Exactly. And hopefully I'll do this.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Morning.
Welcome to our Shabbat morning services at Congregation Beth-El at the Kaufman-Shukman Chapel. I am Rabbi Dennis Sasso. It's Rabbi Hal Shevitz, and we welcome you whether you're with us in person or joining us virtually. If you are joining us virtually, we call your attention to the website, bez613.org, where you can access our Shabbat prayer book and resources for this service. We'll begin on page 103 as we give thanks for the beginning of a new day and the blessings that it brings to us. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lasech vivina leavchin ben yom uvein laila.
Amen.
Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani betzalmo. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani ben chorin.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani Yisrael.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam albish arumi.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kefufi.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rokah haaretz al hamayim.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam emechin mitzadek aver.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa li kol tzorki.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Ozer Yisrael b'gvura.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael betifara.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam anoter layav koach.
Amen. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam amavir sheina me'einai utnuma me'afapai. Praised are you, Adonai, sovereign of time and space, who removes sleep from our eyes and slumber from our eyelids. Welcome to a new day of Shabbat. We give thanks for the world and creative powers that surround us. Page 122. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam.
Baruch hu.
Baruch oseh bereshit.
Baruch omer ve'oseh.
Baruch ozer umkayem.
Baruch merachem al haaretz.
Baruch merachem al habriot.
Baruch meshalem sachar tov lireav.
Baruch meshalem sachar tov lireav. Baruch ha'la'ad v'kayam lanetzach.
Baruch podeh umatzil. Baruch shemo.
On page 136, we continue with Ashrei, a transliteration on page 181. Ashrei yoshvei veitecha, od yehallelucha selah.
Ashrei shekacha lo, Ashrei sh'Adonai Elohav.
Tehila leDavid, aromimcha Elohai hamelech, ve'avarcha shimcha leolam va'ed.
B'chol yom avarcheka, v'yadada shimcha leolam va'ed.
Gadol Adonai umechulal meod, ve'ligdulato ein cheker.
Dor ledor yishabach masecha, gvurotecha yankitu.
Hadar kevod odecha, v'divrei nefleotecha asicha.
Vezuz dorotecha yomeru, uglotecha asaprena.
Zeker rav tuv hayabiu, v'tzitkatecha yeranenu.
Chanun berachum Adonai, erech apayim ugdol chased.
Tov Adonai lakol, v'rachamav al kol ma'asav.
Yoduch Adonai kol ma'asecha, v'chasidecha yivarchucha.
Kevod malchutcha yomeru, ugevuratcha yedaberu.
Lehadi levnei Adam gvurotav, uchvod adar malchutav.
Malkutecha malkut kol olamim, umemshaltecha bechol dor vador.
Somech Adonai lechol hanoflim, v'zokef lechol hakefufim.
Einei chol elecha yisaberu, ve'ata noten lachem et ochlam beito.
Poteach et yadecha, umasbir lechol chai ratzon.
Tzadik Adonai bechol derachav, vechasid bechol ma'asav.
Karov Adonai lechol korav, lechol asher yikreu v'emet.
Retzon yire'av ya'aseh, ve'et shavatam yishma ve'yoshiem.
Shomer Adonai kol hava, ve'kol shaim yashmid.
Teilat Adonai yedaber pi, vivarech kol basar shem kodsho, leolam va'ed. Va'anachnu nevarech yam, me'ata ve'ad olam. Hallelujah. And we turn to page 141 for Psalm 150, concluding with the theme of praise. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, betzilzelei shama. Hallelujah, hallelujah, betzilzelei truah. Kol neshama techalelia. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Kol neshama techalelia. Hallelujah, hallelujah. We continue on page 145. Nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu beruach kol basar teferu tromem zichercha malkeinu tamid min haolam ועד עולם. The soul of all living, praise your name, Adonai, our God. The spirit of all flesh exalts you, our sovereign always. And we will praise, acclaim, and honor you and bless your sacred name, fulfilling David's words, Barchi nafshi et Adonai v'chol krovai et shem kodsho. Let Adonai, my soul, bless, and every fiber of my being praise God's sacred name. Turn to page 147 for the introduction of the morning Shacharit service. Shochinad Maharim Vekadosh Shemo Vechatuv Ranenu Tzadikim Ba'adonai Layesharim Na'ava Tehila Befi Yesharim Tithalal ובדברי צדיקים תתברך, ובלשון חסידים תתרומם, ובקרב קדושים תתקדש, ובמקהלות רביבות עמך בית ישראל, ברינה יתפרשים המלכנו בכל דור ודור, שכן הובאת כל היצורים לפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואימותינו, להודות, להלל, לשבח, לפאר, לרומם, לקדר, לברך, להעלה ולקלס על כל דברי שירות ותשבחות דוד בן ישי עבדך משיחך ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו אל המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ובארץ. 148. ברכות והודאות מעתה ועד עולם, ברוך אתה אדוני אל מלך גדול בתשבחות, אל ההודאות אדון הנפלאות, הבוחר בשירי זמרה, מלך אלוהי העולמים. Please rise. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה בעולמה דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחיי קון וביומי קון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה יתברך יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומן ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמא ואמרו ברכו את אדוני המבורך ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם יוצר אור ובורא חושך עושה שלום ובורא את הכל. Praise the eternal sovereign of time and space who forms light, creates darkness, and brings harmony to all creation. Please be seated. Continue on page 151, El Adon, a celebration of creation. El Adon al kol hamasim, baruch umevorach befi kol neshama, godlo v'tuvo malei olam, da'at utevuna sovevim oto. המתגאה על חיות הקודש ונדר וכבוד על המרכבה זכות ומישור לפני כיסו חסד ורחמים לפני כבודו טובים מאורות שברא אלוהינו יצורם בדעת בבינה ובחסקל כוח וגבורה נתן בהם להיות מושלים בקרב תבל מלאים זיו ומפיקים נוגה נאה זיום בכל העולם שמחים בצאתם וששים בבואם עושים באימה רצון קונם פאר וכבוד נותנים לשמו צהולה ורינה לזכר מלכותו קרא לשמש ויזרח אור רע והתקין צורת הלבנה שבח נותנים לו כל צבע מרום תפארת וגדולה שרפים ואופנים וחיות הקודש. Rabbi Hal, can I ask you to pick it up at 153, please?
Sure. תתברך צורים הכן וגודל כולם אהובים, כולם ברורים, כולם גיבורים, כולם עושים בהמה וברצון כונם וכולם פורחים מפיהם מקדושה ותורה ושירה וזמרה ומברכים שבחים ומפארים ומעריצים מקדישים וממליכים את שם האל מלך הגדול הגיבור ונקושו וכולם מקבלים עליהם מלשמה זה מזה ונותנים רשות זה לזה להקדיש אותם בנחת רוח בשפה ברורה ובנימה קדושה כולם כחלונים אומרים ביראה קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלך כל הארץ כבודו ואהובני וחי את הקדוש ברוך הוא Orchad al Chatzion Tair V'nizkechu L'Namera Le'oro Baruch Atah Adonai Yotzer HaMeorot. You have loved us deeply, Adonai our God, and showered us with boundless compassion. Avinu Malkeinu, for the sake of our ancestors who trusted in you and to whom you taught the laws of life, so may you be gracious and instruct us. V'ha'erenenu b'toratecha v'dabek libeinu b'mitzvotecha v'yachel levaveinu li'ahava u'yira et shemecha v'lo nevosh le'olam v'ad v'lo nevosh le'olam v'ad ki v'shem kodshecha gadol v'anora b'adaknu nagida v'nismecha nagida v'nismecha v'shuhatecha v'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanvot haaretz v'tolichenu komemiyut le'artzeinu ki elpo yeshuotata uvanu v'acharta mikol ha'melashon v'keravtanu l'shimcha gadol zela zela be'emet v'hodadecha u'yachelcha u'yachelcha b'yava baruch atah Adonai havocher b'yamo Yisrael b'yava. We rise for our affirmation of faith as we continue on page 155. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed V'yahavta et Adonai Elohecha B'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh asher anochi mitzavcha hayom alevavecha v'shinatam levanecha v'nibaharta bam Meshivtecha bevetecha ubelechecha baderech ubeshochbecha ubekumecha ukshartam liot al yadecha ve'ayu letotavot beineinecha uktavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha. We continue silently with the prayers, the paragraphs of the Shema on 156. V'hayam shmoti shmom. Leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'tem kedoshim le'elohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotziti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim li'ot lachem le'elohim ani Adonai Elohechem Adonai Elohechem emet. You may be seated. משמע. לדורת הרבים משמע קיים וחיזנו מחותל בן תליאב קיימת. זרועת אבותינו אתה. ועודה מגן ראשים. We continue in the middle of page 158. We sing the song of freedom that Moses, Miriam, and all the people sang as they crossed the sea to freedom. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh, norati hod osef eleh. שירה חדשה שמחו גאולים לשמחה על שפת הים יחד כולם הודו והמליכו ויאמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד צור ישראל קומה בעזרת ישראל ובדרכינו ממך יהודה וישראל גואלנו אדוני צבאות שמו קדוש ישראל ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. We rise for the Amidah, our Shabbat wording Amidah on page 159. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Konei Hakol V'Zocher Chastei Avot Imot U'Mevi Goel Livnei V'Neihem L'man Shemo B'Yahava Melech Ozer V'Gan Moshiach Magen Baruch atah Adonai Magen Abraham V'Ezrat Sarah Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai Mechayei Metim Atah Rav V'Hoshia Mechalkei Chaim B'Chesed Mechayei Metim B'Rachamim Rabim Somech Noflim V'Rofech Cholim Umatir Asurim Umekayem Emunato Lishenei Afar Mi Chamocha Baal Givurot Umito Melach Melech Memit Umechayeh Umatzmiach Yeshua V'ne'emanat ala hachayot metim Baruch atah Adonai mechayei hametim Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam Keshem shemakdishim oto bishmei marom Hakatuv hayad neviyecha V'karazel ze v'yamar Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevot, Melech haaretz kivoto. Az b'kol rash gadol, adir v'chazak mashmi'im kol, mitnasim le'umat serafim, l'umatam baruch yomeru. Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimkomo Mimkomcha Malkinu Tofia V'timloch Aleinu Ki mechakim anachnu lach Matai timloch b'Tzion B'karav b'yameinu Le'olam va'ed tishkon Titkana v'titkadash B'toch Yerushalayim Ircha Ledor Vador U'lenei לנצח נצחים. ועינינו תראנה, תראנה מלכותך כדבר האמור בשירי עוזך על ידי דוד משיח צדקך. ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהיך ציון לדור ודור. הללויה. לדור ודור נגיד קולך לנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש ושבחך חי אלוהינו מפינו לימוש לעולם ועד. כי אל מלך גדול וקדוש אתה ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. We continue with the remainder of the Amidah silently through page 166 with the traditional words of prayer and the prayers of our own hearts.
May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our heart be acceptable to you, Adonai, our strength and our Redeemer. May you who create peace in the universe grant peace to us, to Israel, and to all who dwell on earth. And let us say Amen. Amen. May be seated. Page 167, we continue with the Kaddish Shalem. A brief word about this version of the Kaddish. The word Shalem, of course, means in Hebrew full. Means this is the longer version of the Kaddish. It is also referred to as the Kaddish Tit Kabal, and that alludes to the beginning of the third to last paragraph. Tit Kabal Tzilotchon Uvautchon. Tit Kabal means acceptance. May the prayers that we have uttered be accepted. So this is the Kaddish that comes at the end of the Amidah, an imploration that what we have said be in fact graciously received by God. This is one of several forms of the Kaddish. The most familiar, of course, is the mourner's Kaddish, Kaddish Yatom, that we recite at the end of the services and during the period of mourning. And then the shorter version of the Kaddish, the Kaddish, the Chatzi Kaddish. And there's a scholar's Kaddish that is recited in the context of a period of study, the conclusion of a period of study. And that's probably how the Kaddish originated, as a prayer recited by scholars in the Beit Midrash at the conclusion of a session of study, thanking God, praising God for the opportunity to study God's Word, the teaching, the Torah. It became, because of the fact that often study was held in houses of mourning, associated with the mourning process. But the word for death does not occur in the Kaddish. It is, to the contrary, a praise and an affirmation to the source of life. יתקדל ויתקדש מי רבה, בעולמה דברה קריאותי וימליך מלכותי, בחיי קון ובימי קון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו, אמן, יהי שמי רבה מברך, לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומן ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשא לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו
Amen.
תתקבל צלות כל ובאותכון דכל ישראל קדם אבוכון דבישמעיה ואמרו
Amen.
יהי שלמה רבה מן שמעיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו
Amen.
הוא עושה שלום במרומיו והוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו
Amen.
We turn to the service for the reading of the Torah, page 168.
En kamocha Elohim Adonai ve'en kemasecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim umemshaltecha bechol dor v'ador Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed Adonai oz le'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom avarachamim hetir v'hitzolcha et Zion Tivnech Chomot Yerushalayim Ki Becha Levad Vatachnu Melech Eram V'nisa Adon Olamim. Please rise as the doors of the ark are open. Vayehi binso Aaron, Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai, Veyavutsu Oivecha, Veyanusu Misanecha, Mipanecha, Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udevar Adonai mirushalayim Baruch shenatan Torah Torah Baruch shenatan Torah Mo Yisrael B'Kedushato. Page 171. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu
Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo
Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo Ramema Shemo Yachtav Adonai Hagidurah Ve'Hagivurah Ve'Hatiferet Ve'Hanetzach Ve'Hahod Ki kol v'shamayim u'va'aretz Ki kol v'shamayim u'va'aretz Adonai hamamlacha ve'haminase lechol erosh. Yeah, we're good. I got it. Please be seated.
talk from here, over there.
Wherever you feel comfortable.
I'll go over there. I'll stay here. I'll stay here. I'm good here. Good here. Got the Torah to keep me company. On Thursday, June 30th of this year, a truly horrific and troubling incident took place in Jerusalem. Now, June 30th was the first day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, and 3 B'nai Mitzvah were being celebrated at the egalitarian section of the Western Wall, also known as Ezrat Yisrael or Robinson's Arch. Dozens of teenage Haredim disrupted the Jews praying and celebrating there, shouting over the services, blowing whistles, ripping up prayer books, and calling the worshippers animals, Christians, shiksas, and even Nazis. In one case caught on camera, a Haredi teen ripped a page out of a siddur and wiped his nose with it while smirking. This was an especially disrespectful act for someone who is supposedly a very pious, God-fearing person. The Masorti movement, Israel's equivalent to the American conservative movement, and the movement to which these celebrating families belonged, later said in a public statement, I quote, "How can a nation of Jews allow a reality in which people fear for their security when they are just trying to pray in their own way in a plaza that was specifically designated for this type of prayer?" Unquote. Rabbi Ari Hasit, who officiated one of these ceremonies, later wrote in a public Facebook post that he was broken by the ordeal, also stating, quote, "This was an American boy who wanted to celebrate reaching the age of mitzvot, a boy who could have forgotten any connection with the Jewish people in the land of Israel, but chose to go up to the Torah in Israel in front of his parents, his grandfather, grandmother, and family." End quote. Now, the egalitarian section of the Western Wall is located on the southern part of the wall, separate from the main plaza, which is separated by gender. It is meant to be a prayer space for use by progressive streams of Judaism that allow men and women to be together during services. While the big story was the disruption of these B'nai Mitzvah, it's far more likely that these young Haredim were there to protest against the Women of the Wall, a feminist group of liberal and modern Orthodox Jews that holds female-led services at the Western Wall on the first day of every Hebrew month. June 30th was one of these, and as occurs every month, busloads of ultra-Orthodox young men and women, mostly from seminaries, were sent to the Western Wall to confront them. The Women of the Wall are unfortunately used to this kind of treatment, which they have experienced for decades. Now, during these B'nai Mitzvah, a small number of police officers were present, and they attempted to keep the protesters away from the family, but they did not otherwise intervene or move the Haredi boys away. Even so, those present said that one of the bar mitzvah boys, whose ceremony was specifically interrupted, ignored what was going on and chanted his haftarah unfazed by the distractions. A few days after the incident occurred, Rabbi Avi Shafran, the director of public affairs and spokesman for Agudath Israel of America, which represents Haredi Jews in America, said, and I quote, "I am ashamed, as all principled Orthodox Jews who understand what being Orthodox means should be, that acts like those reported took place." End quote. He went on to say, quote, "We Orthodox Jews, centrist, yeshivish, Hasidic, or otherwise, teach our young to respect all Jews as brothers and sisters and to love them as such. We are exhorted constantly to care about all other Jews and to treat them with honor." End quote. Now, while these are fine sentiments, they come from an American who is the beneficiary of an atmosphere and lifestyle of religious pluralism and acceptance. I have yet to see any such statement from a Haredi leader in Israel. The confluence of the Jewish calendar and our Torah portion this week may help us reflect upon this disturbing event. This week we read from Parshat Pinchas, whose story began in the final verses of last week's Torah portion. Now, at the end of Parshat Balak, we read that Pinchas took a spear and impaled a man and a woman who were engaging in foreign worship and sexual impropriety. His actions stopped the religious rebellion. In this week's Torah portion, we learn more details about the story, that Pinchas' zealousness matched God's zealousness and anger regarding the incident. That because of Pinchas' actions, he was rewarded with a brit shalom, a covenant of peace, and the priestly line continuing through his family. And that this rebellious act was committed by an Israelite tribal head and the daughter of a Midianite priest. Now, this was indeed a moment of religious and moral rebellion. Pinchas looks around at his fellow Israelite leaders, including Moses, and thinks, why y'all standing around doing nothing? And so he acts to save his people from straying from God. In reflecting upon Pinchas' actions, Jewish tradition is very uncomfortable with this. The rabbis have to contend with the fact that God rewards Pinchas for his vigilante justice, on the one hand, and their discomfort with his acting outside the law, on the other. Now, the rabbis acknowledge that he single-handedly saved Israel and defended the Israelite religion, which was his duty as a priest. However, the Talmud says that if Pinchas had asked permission to act from the Sanhedrin, the governing council of rabbis, which of course did not exist at the time, they would have told him no, that he could not do that. A midrash lists a series of miracles that occurred for Pinchas in that moment to aid his act of zealousness, as if to say, only in a moment like this one, where you are blessed with miracles, would this kind of act be allowed. Rashi says that the two parts of Pinchas' story are separated by a parsha break so that we do not connect his act with his reward. In a nutshell, Pinchas is complicated. It may very well be that in the wilderness at that moment, Pinchas' act of killing those two people was good for religion. But Judaism is an evolving tradition, and what was good for religion then at that moment might not be good anymore. The rabbis clearly understood the historical frame, that they were living in a different time than the stories they were commenting on, which took place 1,000 years or more earlier. Now, this past Sunday was the observance of the 17th of Tammuz, a fast day which commemorates when the walls of Jerusalem were broken through in the year 70 CE by the Romans. We will announce in a few moments the beginning of the month of Av, and in 2 weeks' time is the 9th of Av, the day we commemorate the destruction of the temple. Now, the rabbis blame the destruction of Jerusalem on sinat chinam, baseless hatred for each other, violence towards one another. Tradition does not place the blame of the destruction of the temple on the Romans, but rather on Jews who attacked other Jews for being the wrong kind of Jews. The irony of these Haredim is that the same youth who cursed and spat on Jews and tore up their Sidurim most likely fasted on the 17th of Tammuz as a recognition of the baseless hatred and Jewish infighting that led to the destruction of the temple. The situation is what happens when a small group of Jews view other Jews as not Jewish. But actually more than not Jewish, but rather something subversive, trying to destroy what they believe is authentic Judaism. For these Haredi youth, men and women davening the traditional words of prayer in Hebrew is as bad as the intercourse and foreign worship of an Israelite chieftain and the daughter of a Midianite priest. They might believe that they are Pinchas, but they are really the ones engaging in sinat chinam. But there's a bigger issue here. I honestly do not fault the Haredim for not being religious pluralists. That's not who they are, and that's not what our expectations of them should be. However, we should expect derech eretz, basic human decency. It should be that people in a decent society who value derech eretz do not verbally attack or humiliate others in public. Rabbi Yaakov Meidan, who is a leading figure in Israeli Orthodox Judaism, has taught that when one sees in the Torah something that is not decent, we have to name that before we start interpreting it away. 20th century Jewish philosopher Viktor Frankl taught that there are only two races, the decent and the indecent. if the religious practice of liberal and modern Orthodox Jews is not going to be accepted by the Haredim, we should at least, at the bare minimum, expect derech eretz, minimal decency and respect for fellow Jews. Well, it might sound counterintuitive and painful at this moment, but the real solution might actually be to reach out, to connect with Haredim, not with the intent of convincing them that it's okay for men and women to be equal in ritual participation, but to break down barriers and show them that we are all Jews who are part of Am Yisrael. And maybe that in turn will create some respect among liberal Jews for the deep knowledge of Torah and commitment to Jewish living that Haredim have. We cannot let it turn into us versus them. We already have too much of us versus them in our lives already. Pinchas is a divisive figure, and Sinat Chinam is a destructive force. Instead of following those paths to annihilation, let us engage in derech eretz, common decency, and build a stronger and more united Jewish people. Am Yisrael. Shabbat Shalom.
Amen. Yasher koach, Rabbi. We talked a little bit about this last night, and in fact, Rabbi Shevitz and I, for those of you who were here, engaged in a little bit of a dialogue about the issue. And this is not just an issue of days old in the Torah and of Jews praying at the wall. This is a very present reality in our own society nowadays. Significantly, what happened on January 6th can be understood as that type of violent opposition to that which you disagree with. And it can happen at a religious level, it can happen at a political level, all types of ideologies. You're probably familiar with the work of Martin Marty, the renowned American sociologist of religion. He has written a lot, but he has 2 huge volumes on fundamentalism, fundamentalist approaches to religion and ideology. I have it right in there. I see it. Essentially, the 2 volumes can be summarized like this, and it captures exactly what Rabbi Shevitz said. For the fundamentalist, it is not that I differ with your opinion. It is that your opinion is wrong. It's not only that your opinion is wrong, but that your opinion is a sin. Therefore, it is against God's will. Therefore, I, as one who knows the will of God, have to oppose you at any possible means that I can. And my violence is no longer a sin. It is an act of piety. So this is the time in which we live. And there are going to be a lot of issues going forward in our nation in the year and years ahead. We are going to be dealing with this conflict at a political level, at a religious level. What has happened in the Supreme Court is not just a difference of ideology, politically, how to interpret the Constitution, originalism, or interpret. This is a fundamental rupture in American politics, introducing religion as an interpretive value for the life of the nation, and one view of religion. Thanks for opening up that conversation. We're going to continue with the Torah reading. We are grateful to the representatives of Sisterhood and of the congregation, of our daily minyan, who will be reading Torah today. In order to avoid too much traffic on the pulpit, what we would like to do is to have the reader of the aliyah, if that's a single aliyah, that person is having to recite the blessings for that aliyah. In case of multiple aliyot, as Amanda and I think Carol have, then I think you have designated somebody in the congregation to recite the blessings, which we ask you to do standing at your place. Okay, where do we go?
Well, I'm going to introduce our readings today. You can find them on page 931 on Eitz Chaim. We are reading beginning Numbers chapter 28, verse 16 and following. This is from Parshat Pinchas, the latter portions reading the sections of the offerings that comprise the maftir readings on the festivals. So the offerings that were given in the Mishkan on the festivals. 9:31, chapter 28, verse 16. V'yazor v'yagen v'yoshil l'chol ha'chizbo v'nomar amen ha'kol ha'vu godel ha'inu utnu chavod la'torah Yina la'amod rishon Baruch shenatan Torah l'mo Yisrael b'kedushato v'atem madbikim Adonai lechem chaim kulchem hayom. Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kervanu Lavodato V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Ata Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
ובחודש הראשון ב14 יום לחודש פסח לאדוני וב15 יום לחודש הזה חג 7 ימים מצות יאכל ביום הראשון מקרא קודש כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו ויקרבתם אישי עולה לאדוני פרים בני בקר שניים ואיל אחד ושבעה כבשים בני שנה תמימים יהיו לכם ומנחתם סולת בלולה בשמן 13 לפר ו12 להיל תעשו יסרון תעשה לכבש האחד לשבעת הכבשים ושעיר חטאת עזים לכפר עליכם מלבד עולת הבוקר אשר לעולה התמיד תעשו את אלה חילה תעשו ליום 7 ימים לחם אשר ריח ניחוח לאדוני על עולת התמיד יעשה ונזכור וביום השביעי מקרא קודש יהיה לכם כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. The second aliyah begins in verse 26. Now the Amod Sheni. Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed. Amen.
וביום הביקורים בהקריבכם מנחה חדשה לאדוני בשבועותיכם מקרא קודש יהיו לכם כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו והקרבתם עולה לריח ניחוח לאדוני פרים בני בקר שניים איל אחד 7 כבשים בני שנה ומנחתם סולת בלולה בשמן 13 עזרנים לפר האחד 2 עזרנים לאיל האחד יסרון לכבש האחד לשבעת הכבשים שעיר עזים אחד לכפר עליכם מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתו תעשו תמימים יהיו לכם ונזכיהם.
It's her turn. Amen. The third Aliyah continues, chapter 29, verse 1 through 6. Nala amod shlishi.
Let's see. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Borach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten ha'Torah.
Amen.
I lost it again.
Top paragraph right there. Begin the paragraph.
Of course. Uvachodesh hashvi'i v'yachad lachodesh mikra kodesh yeh lachem kol melachet avodah lo ta'asu yom teruah yeh lachem v'asitem ola l'reach nichoach l'Adonai par ben bakar echad ayil achad kevasim b'nei shana shivat mimim uminchatam solet pelula pashemen shalosha esranim lapar shnei esranim la'ayil va'isaron echad la'keves ha'echad lishivat hakavasim useir izim echad chatat lapar lechaper alechem milvad ola tatamid ola tachodesh umichata V'olata kodesh V'olata tamid u'milchata v'niskeihem k'mishpatam l'reach nichoach ishel Adonai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chai olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah.
Amen. Nalamod Revi'i, verse 7. Begin right here. Sorry.
Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Borach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten ha'Torah.
Amen.
Uve'asor lachodesh hashvi'i hazeh mikra kodesh yihyeh lachem ve'inaytem et nafshotechem kol melacha lo ta'asu ve'hikraftem olah la'adonai reach nichoach par ben bakar echad ayel echad kevasim b'nei shana shiva t'mimim yihiyu lachem uminchatam solet Belula. Let's start that again. Uminchatam solet belula shemen shlosha esronim lapa shnei esronim la'ayel hacha isaron la'keves hachan l'shivat ha'kebasim se'ir yizim echad chatat milavad Chata takipurim ba'ola tatamid uminchata v'nizkehem. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Nalamor Chamishi. We continue with verses 12 through 16. Starting right here.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Uvahamisa asher yom lahodesh hashvi umikra kodesh yeh lachem kol milchet avada lo ta'asu vehagotem hag ladonai Shivat Yamim Vehakravtem Ola Isha Rech Nihoch Ladonai Parim Ben Vakar Shlosha Asar Elim Shnayim Kevasim Ben Bnei Shana Abba Asar Tamimim Yiu Uminchatam Solet Bilula Bashamen Shlosha Asronim Lapar Ha'echad Lishlosha Asar Parim Shnai Asurim Esronim La'el ha'echad lishnei ha'elim ha'elim v'yisaron lekevesh ha'echad le'arva asher asar kevashim Va'asir Ve'useir Azim Echad Hata'at Milvad Olat Hatamid Min Hata Uniska. Small print that I practiced with. Sorry. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata betochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Now the Amod Shishi. We continue verse 17 through 28. For this reading, these are the offerings of the most of the days of Sukkot. Baruch Adonai Barach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Barach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Uvayom hasheni parim b'nei bakar Nemasar elim shanayim kivasim b'nei shana arba asar tamimim uminchatam v'nizkehem laparim laelim v'lakvasim b'misparam kamishpat usirizim echad hatat milvad olat hatamid umin chatav v'nizkehem v'yom hashlishi parim ashte asar elim shanayim kivasim b'nei shana arba asar tamimim umin chatam v'nizkehem laparim lailim v'lakvasim b'misparam kamishpat usira chatat echad milvat olat hatamid umin chatav v'nizkah uvayom harivi parim asara elim shanayim Kevasim b'nei shana arba asar tamimim min chatam v'nizkehem laparim lailim v'lakvasim b'misparam kamishpat usirizim echad chatat milvad olat hatamid umin chatav v'nizkah Uvayom hachamishi parim tisha elim shanayim kevasim b'nei shana arba asar tamimim umin chatam v'nizkehem laparim lailim v'lakvasim b'misparam kamishpat Usir chatat echad milvad olat hatamid umin hatav v'nizkah.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata betochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Now the Amod Shvi'i. We're doing 7? Okay.
Baruch Adonai Hamborah.
Baruch Adonai Barach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai
Shishi right there.
Of course. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. We're beginning at verse 29 through chapter 30, verse 1.
Wait a minute, is this?
Yom Shishi. Right.
No, Chamishi.
Sorry, you're reading it. You're reading Shishi. Yom Shishi. Sorry there.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Amen. Uvayom Shishi parim שמונאי שניים כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים ומנחתה ונזקיהם לפרים לאלים ולכבשים ומספרם כמשפט פת ושעיר חטאת אחד מלבדו לתת תמיד מנחתה ונזכה
Unsacheha. That's a weird one.
Oh, I've been doing it wrong the whole time. By Yom HaShvi'i Parim Shimonai Lim Shanayim Kevasim B'nei Shana 14 Tamimim Uminchatam V'nizkehem Lapari V'nizkehem Leparim Le'elim Ulekvasim V'nizpari Kamishpatam Usir Chatat Echad Milvado Letatamid Minchatam V'nizka Bayom Hashmini Atzeret Tia Lachem Kol Melechad Avodah Lo Tasu V'hikravtem Ola Ishareach Nichoach L'Adonai Parechad Ayil Echad Kevasim B'nei Shana Shivat Mimim Minchatam V'nizkehem Minchatam v'nizkehem Lapar la'ayil v'lakvasim V'misparam k'mishpat U'se'ir chatat echad Milvad olat hatamid U'minchata v'nizka Ele Ta'asu la'Adonai b'moadechem Levad nidrechem v'nidvotechem L'olatechem ulem nochotechem Ve'ulenizkechem ulishamechem Vayomer Moshe b'nei Yisrael Lech kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natah betochenu. Baruch atah Adonai notein haTorah.
Amen. And we rise for Chatzi Kaddish, page 174. Yikada ve'yikadash shemei Rabbi Yamad yivrach yirtzeh v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechonu v'yamechon u'chayedecho beit Yisrael b'gala u'bizman karim v'meru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbi mevorach Li'olam olam Yomaya Yitbarach ve'yishtabach V'yidbar v'yirama v'yitnaseh V'yitzadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shemei l'kudusha B'rechu ולעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירה בימה ואמרו Amen. You may be seated. We call up our maftir, our maftira. Ta'amod Chai Rachel bat Gershom Shimon v'Shena Bela maftira chazaka.
Okay, I think I have it.
Okay. We already did it once, so. There, she's fine.
No, but I need a place.
Oh, okay. Got it. Yeah, that's
Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai hamvorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kirav. Where am I? Asher kirav tanu. That's wrong. Isn't it?
Sure.
I'm in the wrong
Is that one? Is that
Yeah,
Asher
thank
Bachar
you.
Banu?
Asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch ata Adonai notein haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. By Yom Hashmini Atzeret Yalachem Kol Melachat Avodah Lo Tasu V'hikravtem Ola Yisher Reach Nicholach L'Adonai Parechad Ayil Echad Kevasim B'nei Shana Shivat Mimim Min Chatam V'nizkehem Lapar L'Ayil V'lakvasim V'misparam K'mishpat Useir Chatat Echad Milvado L'Tatamid U'michatav V'nizka Eileta Suladonai B'moadechem Levad Minidrechem V'nivotechem Lotechem Ulimnochotechem Uliniskehem Ulishamechem Vayomer Moshe b'nei Yisrael kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe.
Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tocheinu. Baruch ata Adonai notein haTorah.
Amen. Continue with the lifting and dressing of the Torah scroll. Please rise. Oops. It's all right. This paper is actually stronger than you think. V'zot haTorah asher sam Moshe Livnei bnei Yisrael ki Adonai b'yad Moshe. Torah, 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 Siva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Siva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Siva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Siva lanu Moshe. May be seated. By the way, just a point, the Torah scrolls here are like half the weight of the ones in my previous congregation. They were like 30, 40 pounds. These are, I mean, it's the same size, but it's like half the weight of it, so it's a lot easier to lift.
It's been on a diet.
Yeah, a lot easier to lift. So, yeah, I can do that. So we read the Haftarah on page 968 of your Eitz Chaim. This is the what?
969.
969. Okay, this is the first Haftarah of admonition, right? The 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av. And we read from the words of the prophet Jeremiah, the first and second chapters. Chapter 1, 1 through 8, finishing up chapter 2, 1 through 3. And he foreshadows destruction caused, and as we come liturgically into these 3 weeks of things that I was speaking about a moment ago, of straying from God, of idol worship and sinat chinam and baseless hatred. And so Jeremiah admonishes and warns about the consequences of these actions.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratzav v'divreihem hanemarin b'amet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah uv'Moshe avdo uv'Yisrael amo uv'nvi'ei ha'emet v'tzedek. Divrei Yirmiyahu ben Chilkiyahu min ha'kohanim asher ba'anatot b'eretz Binyamin asher hayad dvar Adonai elav mimei Yishayahu ben Amon melech Yehuda b'shalosh esrei shana lemalcho vayhi b'mei Yehoyakim ben Yishayahu melech Yehuda adom ashte esrei shana lad Tzidkiyahu ben Yishahu melech Yehuda al galot Yerushalayim b'chodesh hachamishi vayehi dvar Adonai elei lamor baterem etzarcha babeten yidaticha b'terem tetzei mirechem hikdashticha nitnavi legoyim nitaticha va'omar ahav Adonai Adonai hine leyadati daber kinar anochi vayomer Adonai elai al tomar na'at anochi ki al kalashar el eshlacha telech veit kol asher atzucha tedaber al tira mipneihem kitcha ani lahatzilecha nium Adonai vayishlach Adonai et yodo v'yaga al pi vayomer Adonai elai hine natati devarai beficha Shim'u devar Adonai Beit Yaakov V'chol mishpachot Beit Yisrael Ko amar Adonai Matzu avrotechem Bi ava avel Ki rachaku me'olai V'yehu acharei ha'hevel V'yechbalu V'lo amru Aye Adonai, Amale Otanu, Meretz Mitzrayim, Hamolich Otanu, B'midbar, Be'eretz Arava, V'shucha, Be'eretz Siva, V'tzalmovet, Be'eretz Lo Avar Bach Ish, V'lo Yashav Adam Sham. Baruch atah Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur hakol ha'amim, tzadik b'chol hadorot, ha'el ha'ne'eman, ha'omer v'yosef, ha'mdaber ve'umkayem, shekol devarav emet v'tzedek. Ne'eman atahu Adonai Eloheinu, v'ne'emanim devarecha, v'devar echad midvarecha, achor lo yashuv rekam. Ki el melech ne'eman, v'rachaman ata, baruch ata Adonai.
Baruch hu, Baruch Shemo.
Ha'el ha'ne'eman b'chol devarav. Rachem al Tzion ki hi beit chayenu, v'la'aluvat nefesh toshia, b'mheira v'yameinu. Baruch atah Adonai.
Baruch hu, Baruch Shemo.
Misameach Tzion b'vaneha. Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu b'Eliyahu hanavi avdecha, uv'malchut Beit David Mishichecha, b'mheira yavo v'yagel libeinu, al kiso lo yeshev zar, v'lo yinchalu od acherim et kavodo, ki v'shem kodshacha nishbata lo, shelo yichber neiro le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai, Magen David, al haTorah v'al havavdah v'al hanivim v'al yom haShabbat hazeh, shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu, likdusha v'limnucha, lechavod ultifaret. Al hakol Adonai Eloheinu, anachnu modim lach, umvarchim otach, yitbarach shimcha b'fi chochai, tamid le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat.
Amen. Yesher kochech, Tony, thank you. I'd like to thank all our participants in the Torah service today who have read Torah, Haftorah, recited Torah blessings. I think I got you all if I say Amanda, Carol, Sharon, Rebecca, and Tony as readers, and all of you who recited Torah blessings. Before we leave this moment in the service, I'd like to do kind of a pre-return of the Torah and pre-recitation of the new month blessing, Musaf moment. And Musaf is appropriate because traditionally the Musaf service is a rehearsal of, meaning a going over, and an anticipation of the temple sacrificial system. So if you enter an Orthodox synagogue, a prayer would be said in a few moments where we would want for all of this thing to come back that we have read today. What is it? You enter a synagogue, or you go to the temple, not in a synagogue, but the temple would restore the practice of priests offering these burnt sacrifices of bulls and goats and rams and lambs, and flour mixed with oil as gifts to God. So as we read this, essentially what we have here are prescriptions for the barbecues of the festival occasions.
But it's not like barbecue sounds great, but it's not a barbecue. It's a big mess. It's a big mess. Like I would love a barbecue, but it's not a barbecue.
Right. And the reason I ask is because we have to think back and realize that this was the practice of the people we call the people of Israel, from whom we are the descendants. And yet, this Judaism we do here, celebrationally, liturgically, is not very much like that. And yet, there's a link. First of all, we read about this. Year after year, certain weeks, we say it, and we remember our ancestors' worship at the temple. The priests figure highly here. The priests figured in the story of Pinchas, about which Rabbi Shevet spoke. He was a high priest. He was a member of the highest echelons. The priests are the ones who are given the sacrificial system. Shimon and Levi, the ancestor of the priestly class, was a pretty violent guy. So this whole system perhaps is a sublimation of a vehicle by means of which to express that violence. This is our history. What do you think about it? Should we be reading this all the time in the synagogue? Is this a proper way to celebrate our liturgy? How do we connect with this? Now, the thing we can say to us, and it's very true, is it was not only the ancient Jews. All peoples did this. The Romans did it into the early centuries of the Common Era. Liturgia comes from the Latin expression which means the public liturgy, the public celebration, and it was based on sacrificial systems. The Romans practiced similar practices. In fact, they wanted the Jews at the temple to offer a sacrifice to the emperor. And the Jews compromised and said, no, we don't offer a sacrifice to the emperor. We offer sacrifices to the God of Israel. We will offer a sacrifice in honor of the emperor to the God of Israel. This is documented stuff. So this was not odd in its own time. How would you feel coming into the synagogue and or having an outdoor service? We do eat food that is based on these things, and we do say a blessing for that food, and we have transformed our way of gratitude. Essentially, this was an ancient way of expressing gratitude for the goods and praise for the provider. Our religious sensitivities have evolved in ways that we think are better.
I'm of the Maimonidean school. My Maimonides says, that was how we did it because that's how we needed to do it. We've evolved, and now we have words of prayer. And we're eventually going to evolve to this point where we don't even use words of prayer, we'll just contemplate and use our intellect. And Maimonides was all into intellect. But we are people, we communicate verbally. And so Maimonides says this is the stage we're in, and maybe someday in the future we'll get to a stage of pure contemplation, pure intellect and
apprehension of the divine.
Thank you. Apprehension is a good word for that.
Yeah.
And so I'm of the Maimonidean school that we have evolved out of that, and we live in a different era. Like that was a very bloody time. Like the temple was a disgusting place of blood and animal viscera and flowing because they killed animals right there, like hundreds a day.
And yet, in the Orthodox mindset, whether it is meant or not, it is verbalized. Right. This is a practice that would like to be returned to, the temple restored, the sacrificial system reinstated. Maimonides said, we did it because we had to wean them from the ancient practices of the Egyptians, and so we kind of went through this period, but as Rabbi Hal said, we have moved. And for Maimonides, and many of the rabbis, by the way, prayer was itself a transitional stage, because what is greater than prayer? Study. And what is greater than study? Prophecy. According to Maimonides, some people are so gifted in divine matters, theologically, that all they do is they contemplate a form of what today many would call high meditation, et cetera, et cetera. So the tradition is not indifferent to this or immune to the implications of this. But it's important for us to understand that what we call Judaism, and it's my constant message from a Reconstructionist vantage point, is that this is part of a process. We recall, we identify with, but we don't have to practice all the details or elevate them in a way that is inappropriate for our times. And the same thing applies. Treatment of women, treatment of children, all of these things that were acceptable at one time, but we hopefully have moved from. Yes, Amanda?
I was going to say, the reason we chant this is not because 2,000 years ago we did it, but because last generation, the tradition, they chanted it. And, our parents and our grandparents chanted it. And so we chant about it too, and we're connecting with the fact that it's a tradition to chant this without actually going through and doing it.
Right. So it's a remembrance. Wouldn't we have nicer things to chant? I mean, we
do.
have changed melodies. We have changed added prayers. So what is it that keeps this so entrenched? Let me give you another interpretation, because the rabbis who in fact substituted this for this, and before I quote the rabbis, yeah.
We changed Yom Kippur, we changed what we chanted.
That's
and
right.
there are certain times during the year that we have changed the Haftarah because we didn't like the
Right.
Haftarah. And we could change, it's true, and we could change, and we could chant from a different selection. We could have chanted about the daughters of Zelophehad. So I think as long as we continue to chant and to, and to study and to learn from our Torah, I think there's no reason why I have to keep doing those two tropes 5 times a week.
Yeah, what is the most recurrent phrase in the Torah? Isaron, Isaron. You know what my interpretation of that is? 2 Isarons don't make a right. Okay, let me just close with this, and this is a good conversation.
If I can make one point completely separate from this.
Isaron. Go.
The Haftarah that we just read from Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, is meant to be taken as a metaphor, right? In the common debate that we're in our country right now, B'terem et zorcha beveten yedaticha b'terem tetzei merechem hikdashticha, it's a metaphor. It means before I was formed in the belly, I knew you. Before I came out of the womb, I was sanctified. You sanctified me. That's a metaphor, everybody. That's a metaphor. Some things in the Bible are metaphors because literature has metaphors.
Yeah, but
That's a
the
metaphor.
pro-life, the anti-abortion movement quotes this verse to say, you see, you have life while you're in the womb. But this doesn't say that. This says even before you were in the womb.
Before you were.
Meaning a preconception, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a metaphor, everybody.
Speaking of for those of you who are riled up by the special session that the State House is about to do, where abortion will be written on as our laws, except for a few small places, there will be a rally at the State House at 11:30 on Monday.
We mentioned that last night, and it's in your Shabbat announcement leaflets. It's going to be on Monday, it's going to be Friday, a variety of expressions. So whatever might work for you, write letters, call. Okay, last word. What do we call the temple service? What was it called in ancient times? What was the name for the service performed by the priests at the temple? It was avodah. What does avodah mean? It means work, it means labor, it means service, right? This experience we also call, when we sing, ala Torah, al ha'avodah, ve'al gemilut hasadim. The world stands on 3 pillars. Torah, learning, studying, living. avodah. The most generic way to translate that is worship. And gemilut hasadim, deeds of loving kindness, being humane, loving your neighbor as yourself. The word avodah retranslates in Judaism from the temple sacrificial service to prayer. The rabbis call prayer avodah shebalev, the work that is in the heart. And it then substitutes for the sacrificial system as described. Another way in which we do sacrificial system in our tradition is through tzedakah, by giving of yourself, of your resources. Just like our ancestors brought of their resources as expressions of thanksgiving, we now give tzedakah for the alleviation, for the improvement of society. So ideas, traditions are evolve, change. And that is, in many ways, the richness and the beauty of the tradition. And that is why we remember it, even though we don't practice it. So the question is, how do we maintain that balance as we move forward? Okay, let us turn to returning the Torah scroll. Oh, before we turn to the Torah scroll, we are going to announce Rosh Chodesh, the new month. And the prayer for that is on page 180.
Yehi ratzon milfanecha, Yehi ratzon milfanecha, Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, shetechadesh aleinu et hachodesh haba, letova ve'livracha.
Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av, Yihye Beyom Shishi, Haba Aleinu ve'al Kol Yisrael Letova. The new month of Menachem Av will be on Friday of the coming week. May it bring blessing to us and to all Israel.
Mishe'asa nisim lavotenu, Mishe'asa nisim lavotenu, v'galatam evdu l'cherut, v'galatam mikarov, v'kabetzin l'chenu me'barkat fot ha'aretz. Chaverim, chaverim, chaverim kol Yisrael, chaverim, chaverim, chaverim kol Yisrael, chaverim kol Yisrael ben Amar, Amen.
We have already announced the month. Yihacheu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aleinu ve'al Kol Amo Yisrael Letova, Lechaim u'Leshalom,
Amen.
Lesason u'Lesimcha,
Amen.
Liyeshua u'Lenechama ve'nomar
Amen.
Page 183 as we return to Torah scroll. Yekalelu et Shem Adonai,
Ki
Nizkaf Shemo Levado, Odo al Eretz v'shamayim,
Vayarem kerelei hamoti lecho chasidav livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah.
Venucho Yomar
Horati al ta'azovu. Etz chaim hilem machazikim ba v'tomcheha meushar derachea darchei noam v'chol netivoteha Shalom, Hashivenu Adonai, Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh yameinu kegedem.
Let us remain standing for Aleinu on page 205. We'll do Ein Keloheinu as a closing song. Page 205, Aleinu.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol l'teit gedula liyotzeh b'reshit shelo asanu kegoyei haratzot velo samanu kemishpechot ha'adama shelo sam chelkenu kahem וגורלנו כחומונם ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל ושכינתו זו בגובי מרומים
ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד.
לפניך ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד, ושמו אחד.
Mourners and those observing Yortzeit for a loved one, please remain standing. We remember loved ones who have died in recent days and weeks. Barbara L. Mills, Howard Lovinger. We keep them in our hearts alongside those for whom we mourn and those the anniversary of whose death occurred during the last week. As in loving testimony to the faith that links the generations, those who mourn and all who remember sanctify God's name in the words of the Kaddish, page 207. Yitkadal ve'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. Be'olma divra kiriute ve'yamlich malchute b'chayechon ve'yomechon uvechaye dechol beit Israel ba'agala uvizman kariv ve'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam ule'olmei olmaya. Yitbarach ve'yishtabach ve'yitpa'ar ve'yitroman ve'yitnaseh ve'yithadar ve'yitale ve'yithalal shemei dekudsha berichu le'ela min kol birchata ve'shirata tushbechata ve'nechemata da amiran ve'alma ve'imru amen. Yehei shlamar rabba min shemaya ve'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Ose shalom b'imromav u'ya'aseh shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen. May God, the source of peace, grant comfort to all who are bereaved, peace to Israel and to all humanity, and let us say amen. Once again, let me thank everybody who joined us this morning, everybody who is with us virtually, those of you who read and chanted Torah and Haftarah. I'd like to thank Shari Levine, our executive director, for serving as a welcoming host this morning, and Tori Ehrman for connecting us with the outside world. I do have a couple of copies, I believe, of an article that Sandy and I wrote for the IBJ on the subject of Judaism and reproductive rights, particularly emphasizing the issue of freedom of religion, but also centrally women's health care, of which abortion care is part. It's health care. So we invite you to take that or to go to the IBJ and to stay informed, to support the cause, because it's not over. Is there Kiddush? Kiddush in the auditorium. And let's close singing Ein Keloheinu, a melody that some of you may remember. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, ein kemalkeinu, ein kemoshienu. 204. Mi Elokeinu, mi Adonenu, mi kemalkeinu, mi kemoshienu, ein kelokeinu, ein kadonenu, ein kemalkeinu, ein kemoshienu, ein kelokeinu, ein kadonenu, ein kemalkeinu, ein kemoshienu. Atahu Elokeinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, ein kelokeinu, ein kadonenu, ein kemalkeinu, ein kemoshienu, ein kelokeinu, ein kadonenu, ein kemalkeinu, ein kemoshienu. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Hal Shevitz, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom. All right. Okey-doke, let's take this. Take that. All right. Here are these.